So all the way back when I started gaming in the early 2000s, all the way up to the end of the PlayStation 3 generation, I had been all about racing games. I grew up watching motorsport like Formula 1 and then later MotoGP, and so I loved playing racing games, starting from games like Lego Racers up to Burnout, eventually Gran Turismo and Grid, and many other racing games in between. And yet for the first 2 years of the PlayStation 4 generation, I hadn't had a single entry in my library. There had been a few games that had come out such as Drive Club, but they never quite satisfied what I wanted from a racing game. They didn't quite look like games I wanted to play. But then in 2015 came the announcement of Project Cars, an independently developed simulator racing game, which was attempting to create an experience which allowed you to go from the grassroots of go-karts all the way up to the major categories like Formula 1 and the World Endurance Championship. So it'll be interesting to see how did this game deliver, did it match my expectations, and did it live up to the games that I'd played for many years previously. We'll be covering all of that as I revisit Project Cars. Hi there everyone, I'm the guy with no gamer tag, and when this game came out it wasn't one that I instantly picked up. This is mostly due to my skepticism, having looked at many racing games that had been released that didn't quite look what I wanted to play, so I waited to see what reviews were like and then eventually was given this for my birthday. And I really did start to enjoy this game when I first got it. I enjoyed playing the single player, it had a good amount of depth, I enjoyed the vehicle physics for the most part, and it did satisfy that racing game itch that I'd been looking for. But the longer I played it, the more it started to show some of its rough edges, and it showed that it wasn't quite up to scratch to compete with some of the biggest names in simulator racing at the time, such as Gran Turismo and Forza. Now the first main thing with this game was that it is a bit light on its cast of cars. It has a great variety of categories you can race in, but the actual cars themselves are quite limited. Most categories may only have 2 different cars you can enter into them. There are some with better variety, such as the road car challenges where you maybe have up to 4 different types, but it still felt a little bit light on the ground in terms of the overall roster of cars. A similar criticism was also lent towards the tracks. There is a reasonable variety of the tracks. It's got your world famous circuits, it's got the occasional rip-offs of them, and it's also got good road courses. But overall, it didn't feel like the game, especially in the single player, really forced you to many different tracks. It kind of used the same tracks a lot, especially in the lower categories. And then finally, the physics, which I had enjoyed when I first started playing, do still have some issues with them, which was something I also noticed when I went back to play the game, but I'll be talking about that again a little bit later. But the main thing that really decreased my enjoyment of this game was how the single player was structured. And in some ways it was my own fault, and I'll be sure to mention where that was the case, is that you choose which category you want to start in. There's about 7 different tiers of racing, and you can choose which one you want to start in. I personally wanted to experience the entire breadth of this game, go through the whole racing journey this game offered, going from go-karts up into cars, then into much more advanced and faster cars, all the way up to eventually the World Endurance Championship. That was what I wanted to do. I wanted to have that story to my playthrough. And yet, I never quite managed to get that. When you start in the lowest kart series, you're just going around various tracks around the UK. I went through all the kart races, I've managed to win them quite easily with the low difficulty I had the game set to, and so I was able to progress quite quickly. However, when you get to the end of a season, you'll start to get offered new contracts, which you can then choose to decide which racing category you would race in next season. And of the 3 contracts I was given, I had 2 contracts to race for teams I hadn't raced for this season, and 1 contract to continue racing with the team I had just participated with. Now, being the racing romantic and seeing Formula 1 success stories over the 2000s and 2010s, I wanted to stay loyal to the team that I'd been with. I wanted to stick with them. But what I didn't realise, because it wasn't necessarily easy to spot in this menu, was that by choosing to stay with the same team, I was also staying in the exact same category, and my career would not progress any further. I would be just stuck in these little babby carts. And that was really frustrating, because I think I spent 3, maybe even 4 seasons in my single player mode just driving these same go-karts and getting a few invitational events in cars and racing cars which were fun, and it was enjoyable getting that variety. But I was just stuck in these go-karts that in the end I didn't really enjoy driving. Now when I come back and play this in 2021, I did realise that this was partly my own fault. It does quite clearly say on the contracts that one of them is for a 250cc kart and one of them is for a supercar, and those are different categories. But here's the thing, if you don't know about those categories beforehand, if you haven't photographically memorized that initial career path slide where you could work out which part of the career you wanted to start in, you're not going to realize or necessarily know that a supercar is the next advancement step for your driver's career. And that was something that bugged me, because I went through and played it properly this time. I actually went and did the progression straight away. I didn't go for the romantic stick with a team and get all the glory story. And I was actually able to enjoy the game more. I actually experienced more content from the game than I had originally, because I took the extra time to read and realize, oh wait, these are actually two different categories. If I want to advance, I need to choose a different team. And whilst this might seem like a minor thing, you have to realize that not all the players are going to go through and read this in excruciating detail and work out that they are two different things. It would have been really useful if it had said or given some kind of indication of which one will advance your career and which one will not. I'm surprised that the game gives you the option, especially when you're in the lowest series within the entire game, to just stay in that series and just not optionally progress your career at all. It seems a little bit odd that it would give you that option. But once I did that, I found a lot more enjoyment from the game. The supercarts were considerably faster than the 250cc shifter carts I'd previously been driving, but it also gave me the option to drive in a much wider variety of categories, especially with the invitational events. I got to do the historic GTC trophy in a Mark I Ford Escort, I got to drive a BAC Mono in a track day series, also getting to drive the Caterhams, which I loved driving when I first played the game. And it just opened up way more content to the game, which I hadn't experienced before, because this small menu oversight meant that I just didn't realise I was committing to do the same thing over and over and over again. And I feel like that was a bit of an oversight. At the end of the day, the game was trying to be somewhat realistic in your career progression. It just didn't make it clear which step was a progression and which step wasn't. And that would have made a major difference to my original enjoyment of this game. Now that being said, there were some other issues. One of the main ones that's been reported in reviews by critics as well as users, and one that I agree with, is that the game was pretty buggy at times. I fortunately in my replay through this year haven't experienced nearly as many bugs as I did originally. Most of the bugs I encountered originally were funny. It would be stuff like you start the race but all of the cars are crashed at the end of the track, sat in this weird jumbling pile on top of each other. It meant you had to restart the race, but it was quite amusing. And although not a bug, one of the things I did encounter when I was replaying the game was that there's this one AI character that just seems to love yeeting themselves off the curbs at Snetterton. Like, they just loved sending themselves to the Shadow Realm in every session. I guess you could say they're part of the Kerbal Space Program. And then the other bug I encountered when I replayed the game was this glorious bug where as soon as you enter the pit lane, the AI just loves walls. It just loves them. It just drives straight into them for no apparent reason. I almost want to ask the AI, are you doing this for a bet? But it was just one of those silly things, and it didn't really impact the gameplay, but it was just one of those things which didn't show the polish that a lot of the AAA games it was competing against had. However, the one bug that did really bug me when I did play it, and I'm not sure whether it was a bug or whether it was a mechanic that I didn't perhaps optimize, but I was struggling to learn some of the cars. So what I did was I changed my pit setup to put maximum fuel in, and I would just drive around the track forever, just trying to learn it and just try and get as good as I could in that car on that track. But if you didn't use up all of that fuel by the time you got to qualifying, you still had somewhere around 60 litres at the start of qualifying and for the race, which meant that you stood no chance of competing because you had a massive weight disadvantage to all the other cars. And that really was a bit stupid. And it was annoying, partly because it puts the player at a huge disadvantage, and secondly because it just doesn't make sense. I mean, even in grassroots motorsport, people know how to get fuel out of a car. It's incredible that in this game, it doesn't seem to be the case for a team that is in a professional pit lane. And so it was really a frustrating experience when that happened, because all I wanted to do was learn the cars and get as good as I could. Because especially when you progress from karts to actual cars, you can suddenly find yourself plummeting down the grid because they require a completely different driving style. And I just felt punished for trying to learn them, because I would all of a sudden be at a huge disadvantage as soon as I started the actual racing. But when mentioning the difference between go-karts and real cars, it did highlight an issue that I have with the physics in this game. For the most part, I do really enjoy them. I've heard other people feeling less enthusiastic about the physics, but for me, I enjoy them. It's satisfying. You can more or less feel the grip even on a controller. You can also feel the weight of the car and how sluggishly or quickly it will respond. And that is a detail I really enjoyed with this game. It really made the cars feel unique to each other for the most part. But that being said, the physics for the go-karts just felt completely wrong. I will preface this and say that in real life, I've only ever driven go-karts that a circuit provides. I've never driven shifter go-karts, and so I might have the wrong experience to be able to properly critique this. But the go-karts feel very light and they provide almost no feedback, especially when you're using a controller. As such, it means that you get used to a driving style with the go-karts, which is not compatible when you start driving the cars. With the cars, you've got to be used to braking in a straight line and also using the throttle to kind of guide the car towards the apex. You just don't bother doing that in the go-karts, it's not required. And so it makes that step even harder. And it also highlights then some problems with the difficulty of the game. With the go-karts, I found that even at 100% difficulty, as long as I didn't go off track during the race, I would have it easy. In qualifying, I could be upwards of 3 seconds faster than the next kart. And that's ridiculous. And I think that kind of highlights an issue with the physics, is that not intentionally, I found some way to abuse the go-kart physics so that I gained such an advantage. And then when I go to cars, all of a sudden I'm at the back of the grid because the driving style to go that quickly in those go-karts just isn't compatible with the cars, and I haven't actually learnt the physics of the game. I've just learnt a small subset and a small unintended exploit in one category, which has kind of screwed my entire understanding of how the cars perform in this game. It doesn't make sense that the difficulty would suddenly step from a category where you can go off track and still claim pole position, all the way up to you set the best lap you've done and you're like 5 seconds behind the last place car. I have since played around with the difficulty to try and make it a little bit closer to my skill level, but I'm still way off the pace. And I think that kind of highlights that there is a problem somewhere in the physics, because I'll be surprised if the AI has been scaled up like that to suddenly just make a massive step between go-karts and cars. I think that highlights that there was something wrong with the physics and that unintentionally I'd found a way to exploit it. But when I do race in the cars, it's the thing I enjoy the most. The graphics of this game, whilst perfectly adequate, are not the greatest in racing games, but it still just had that right look to it, where it just felt like racing and it felt like driving, and that's what I like when I do play this game. It's just that feeling of driving, being wheel to wheel in another car, and just going around these awesome tracks in whatever weather. Although, fuck sunset racing, I absolutely hate that, especially when you're trying to learn a track and you've got a practice session at sunset. Like, why? I can't see the track I'm trying to learn. But I do enjoy that aspect of the game, just learning to drive the new cars. Like driving the BAC Mono. When I did the first race, I was at the back of the grid in qualifying. I was pretty darn slow. But during the race, I managed to drive my way up to just outside the top 10. By the second race, I'd managed to qualify in 8th, eventually finishing in 5th. I haven't actually yet done the third race, but it was just nice to have that progression, to see that I was learning how to drive that car and becoming faster at it. And that was really satisfying, and that was what I missed out when I first played this game. And all of it came down to just a small oversight. I think my overall thoughts on this game is that it was fairly ambitious for an indie developer to come in and really tackle the might of games like Gran Turismo and Forza. Was a huge undertaking. It was incredibly ambitious. But unfortunately, because of that, it was a little bit light on the ground in terms of the roster of vehicles and the total number of tracks. The categories, whilst they had some good diversity, they were still fairly minimal, and it just didn't quite have the same polish and refinement and structured progression as the other games I've mentioned. And that was really kind of what let it down. It meant that it wasn't as intuitive as the other games, and it was why in the end I stopped playing it. I have enjoyed going back and replaying it. I do still enjoy the physics, and I may still actually continue to play it now that I've actually worked out how to progress my career. But the criticisms directed towards this game were absolutely valid. It was buggy, it was a little bit light on the ground, and that really was what limited it. But I am interested to hear if any of you have played this game. Did you have similar experiences? Did you encounter any of the amusing bugs I've spoken about? Please feel free to leave that in the comment section down below. But anyway, I've been the guy with no gamer tag, and I'll see you on another video.